Then
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you today?
I'm hugely terrific and you look exquisite.
Well, I can say the feeling is mutual. Likewise, I like your shirt, man.
I am well. Thank you so much. I have to honestly say that I owe you and your Indonesian buddy a profound, huge debt of gratitude for allowing me to be part of your club.
Well, welcome to my Ndiho collection, my friend.
Thank you.
A warm welcome to all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. Today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but I guess I will start in Egypt, where former President Mohamed Morsi died yesterday in court. Morsi was president of Egypt for a short period of time, let's say 1 year to be exact. Shaka, your thoughts about the passing of President Morsi?
It's very unfortunate, and before I go anywhere sincerely, I think that it would be in order to express my condolences and the condolences of Shaka Extra Time to the family and the people of Egypt on the manner in which a former Egyptian president, not only a former Egyptian president, by the way, Paul, from the homework I have done, he's probably the only one, or arguably the only individual holding the office of the president in the history of Egypt that was ever democratically elected. And in fact, at the end of the day, his crime that cost him his life is perhaps because he was in fact democratically elected to the office of president.
Are you suggesting that Egyptians or the Egyptian regime as we speak is allergic to democracy?
Well, I do not see, looking at the history of Egypt, and of course you know the history of Egypt, which was called Misri, is associated with pyramids, great pharaohs, kings including Farouk, the one that was overthrown in 1953 by a younger Colonel, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, a man, by the way, who really had no vanity in the sense that he overthrew the king, and he never, unlike a lot of his colleagues in those types of situations, he never promoted himself from colonel to a general or to a field marshal, just like the one who actually overthrew Mohamed Morsi, a man who is Field Marshal Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And by the way, it is very ironic because Field Marshal Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, not only is he the president of Egypt and is trying to figure out a way of remaining in that office until 2034, but he's also the chairman of the African Union.
That's very, very interesting, considering that right now he's the current spokesperson of the African Union. When you talk to a lot of people or political observers, they say in this particular case, not only did he make sure that his opponent, former President Mohamed Morsi, now deceased president, not only did he make sure that this guy is incarcerated, but he made sure that this guy could not see any justice whatsoever. And there are a lot of critics who say that his death is not a natural death, but perhaps something that was engineered or made by the regime that they killed him. It was a political assassination.
There are, in fact, a lot of observers, including Human Rights Watch, who are on record saying that this may very well be a sort of premeditated assassination. Others call it, of course, premeditated murder. And that is probably true when you look at it scientifically, Paul, because from what I have read and from the kind of research I have done, Muhammad Morsi was apparently suffering from diabetes. And you cannot believe that he was denied the appropriate medicine to treat his condition. He was also denied the appropriate type of food that a person in his condition deserved. He also happened to be really incarcerated in a very, very bad situation. He was in prison for about 8 years, and during that time, it is only 4 times that some members of his family were allowed access to him. Not even the Mandela, the Madiba himself, Nelson Mandela, under apartheid South Africa, did experience those types of things on Robben Island and what have you. I mean, how could this possibly happen in 2019 in Africa? To a man that, by the way, had a PhD from the University of Southern California in engineering to boot and all that kind of stuff. A man, again, as I said earlier, that did not, in fact, shoot his way to that position of president. Just like people like Abdel Fattah el-Sisi actually shot his way, got into that particular office, climbing on the backs, the bodies of so many people. We don't even know the number of people who may have died in the process. You're talking about a very, very unfortunate situation. You're talking about, I mean, somebody who had not been allowed to communicate with anybody. No telephone, no internet, no newspapers, no television, no nothing. And his crime, his only crime really, from what I have seen, is that he was actually able to be democratically elected to be president of Egypt.
Interesting, Shaka. You talked about him having a PhD. You happen to be in the same class of those very few, maybe the 1% of very well-educated people. There is something that I find interesting about PhDs, especially when it comes to African leaders dealing with people with PhDs. What is it? Are these leaders afraid of you guys because as intellectuals you challenge them? Or is it something that goes beyond challenging the status quo? When you look at what Abdel Fattah al-Sisi did to Morsi, it's something that maybe we ought to be talking about more, because it's not only in Egypt where leaders who don't have PhDs have gone after leaders who have PhD. We can look maybe even further south in South Sudan, where the current president, Salva Kiir, has really not had a good relationship with his former vice president, Riek Machar, who has a PhD. You can also extend that to Ethiopia, where the emperor also went after people with PhDs. So what is it? I know people in your particular case, they don't like you because you pose a threat. What is it about PhDs?
I know that you went to some good schools, including the prestigious Makerere University, Kampala. So along the way, perhaps you might have, come across the history of the world. You may have read about people like the great philosopher Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And you know, part of the problem that people like Socrates really posed to the leadership at the time in Greece, which happens to have the distinction, by the way, of having introduced what we call democracy, modern democracy, so to speak. was simply because he always asked some very interesting questions. If you want to do something and you are a leader, he would ask you why. And simply because the individual who happens to hold that position would probably not be in a position to answer that type of question, he would be outraged. Socrates would be stoned. You know, they would organize, the leadership would organize to make sure that not only do they intimidate, but in fact, they really punish Socrates simply because he was the type of person who wanted to know that if there is a problem, and if you are going to solve it really, first of all, you have to establish that there is a problem. And having established that there is a problem, you have to also find out what are the fundamental causes, or what are the fundamental root causes of that problem. Because if you actually can do that, then you will be able to be in a position where you can address that type of situation. That is the reason why, even in terms of modern day medicine, when you meet a doctor, a physician, with a clinic, not like Shaka, with a PhD, doctor of philosophy, even a doctor with a clinic will make sure that before they actually, when they diagnose you, they will have to find out, first of all, what are you suffering from?
That's correct.
Once they establish what you are suffering from, then they will get an idea as to how they can actually identify the type of medicine that you might need in order either to get cured or to manage your ailment, your illness. And so this is the tragedy of an interaction between people who know and those who don't. Those who don't and have, you know, the opportunity to occupy positions of power, they suffer from a sort of complex. They are basically people that feel very uncomfortable around people who they suspect or they know more than they do. And yet, they should in fact be confident enough to surround themselves with those types of people, because those people can actually help them so that together they can develop society, they can develop their country, they can lead their people to Canaan. Because at the end of the day, what is needed is social, economic, political justice for all. What is needed is peace and stability. And you cannot bring about peace and stability in any country unless you are going to consult, you are going to involve some of the more gifted members of your community so that together you can help to develop your country. Take it to another level. You know, there is a saying, Paul, that as an individual, you could actually run very, very, very fast. But as a group or together, you can in fact go very far.
That synergy can take you very, very far.
Interesting.
Let me do a quick follow-up. Let's go back to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. You talked about him as the current spokesperson for the African Union. Rightly so.
Not a spokesperson, by the way.
He's the
He is
chairperson.
the chairman.
Yeah, the chairman. Of course, the face. I meant the face of African Union. But when you look at these developments in Egypt, and you look at Africa as a whole, what kind of what is that supposed to say about Africans and how that institution is run? You have a person who, by any measure or any standard, is a dictator. Then he's at the helm of this great institution. What can young people learn maybe from this kind of scenario?
I think it is a sort of symbolic scandal, symbolic political scandal, to be very honest with you. But then again, we also have to understand that when you talk about an institution such as the African Union, you have to look at its mandate. You have to look at limitations, for example. The African Union does not have sovereign powers, in which case it is not probably as strong as that, as perhaps what we would have wished it to be. It may in fact have some teeth. The question is, do those teeth actually bite? The answer is no, they do not bite, because that is the way it was decided that that institution operates. You have an Africa represented by an African Union at the center, which is weak. And yet you have these member states, individual member states, some of whom are very, very powerful. Egypt, obviously, is one of those more powerful members of the African Union. Nigeria is another one. South Africa is another one, to name just a few.
But you can't put those two countries, Nigeria and South Africa, in the context of Egypt. Clearly, in those countries, we're talking about a democracy here. But in Egypt, I don't think there is even a semblance of democracy.
I think you have a point, except that when it comes to democracy, perhaps we could probably agree that out of those countries, the only democratic country, the only country that could probably arguably be in fact characterized as the beacon of hope for African democracy would have to be South Africa. When it comes to Nigeria, yes, 5 years ago, they had a great election. And to be very honest with you, most Africans were very, very proud of that election. And friends of Nigeria, friends of Africa, were very happy. Even watching, I remember, the transfer of power from one individual, Goodluck Jonathan, to another individual, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, retired but certainly not tired. It was very beautiful. But I'm afraid that the last election has a sort of a static. As a matter of fact, the European Union just issued a statement last week saying that from what it was able to observe, from what it has been able to document, it reached the conclusion that the last election in Nigeria were neither free, fair, nor credible.
Interesting. So then that goes back to my good friend Goodluck Jonathan. I remember in an interview in New York, he told me, personally told me that if it means him picking up the phone and calling his opponent, he will do that for the sake of peace of Nigeria. And in a way he did that. He was able to transfer power for the first time in so many years to another president. But going back to what you said, so is this democracy all about personalities? Because when Buhari came in, we thought he was more of a Democrat. But from what you're saying, or from what the European Union is saying, he's far away from what we thought of the man.
Well, democracy is not about individuals. Democracy is a process that is supposed to provide an opportunity to citizens of a particular country, for example, to choose who should be their leaders, choosing in a manner that is considered, for example, to be free, to be fair, to be transparent, and to be verifiable and credible. These are certain democratic standards. This is the threshold that a country has to meet. Unfortunately, when it comes to democracy, and when you look at Africa, which has 54 countries and 55 member countries of the African Union, if you add Western Sahara, which of course is disputed by Morocco, you will find that generally, when it comes to democracy, most countries on the continent are democratically challenged. I do not think sincerely that I could come up with more than 15 countries that are probably in terms of democracy, they have reached the sort of democratic threshold.
Let's go to comments. Let's start with Amina. What could be the way forward for Sudan? Speaking about democratic challenges, I think Sudan, as we speak, is challenged in that, in a sense that the people rose up and they were able to overthrow the long-time leader, Omar al-Bashir. But since then, there's been this military regime in place has been, fighting. There's been a running battle between the protesters and the regime in charge, the military council in charge. So what do you say about that?
I think that when it comes to Sudan, the people were very courageous, they were very gallant, they were very disciplined, and they were able, unfortunately, to identify and remove a symptom. But what is needed, in fact, what is needed is to identify and remove the fundamental root cause of what makes an individual or what makes a country produce a dictator or dictators. Because, mind you, Field Marshal, but when you talk about Field Marshal Omar Bashir, he was not running the store alone. He was running that store, that political store, with his colleague generals. And these are some of the generals that eased him out because he was clearly identified and he seemed to have irritated a lot of protesters. But at the end of the day, in fact, what is needed is a fundamental change, not a change of guards, not a Paris coup. And I think under the current circumstances, the only way Sudan can get back on track is to figure out how to bring the protesters, for example, their leadership, and the leaders of the military council to figure out some kind of compromise to put these parochial, pettish, selfish interests aside and embrace the national interest. Because at the end of the day, your security is in my security. My security is in your security, and together we can provide a security for the country, not for these few individuals. And I think when you look at Sudan, it has gone through a lot. At one time, I remember, it used to be the largest country on the African continent. But that is no longer the case, especially given that it has now been split into two different countries. And these two different countries, by the way, are neither peaceful nor stable. And so I think it would be in the interest of Sudan, and it would be in the interest of Africa, which for the most part is suffering under dictatorship, to embrace the concept of social, economic, political justice for everybody. After all, when you look at traditional African communities, they reflect some of those values. But when it comes to these people who control the state, this thing called the government, there is a problem.
Let's do a quick follow-up from Elvis. He says it's about the African Union has taken a stand on what's going on in Sudan. But is this a taste of what the African Union is prepared to do, considering that the military has refused to barge in, and despite the fact that they have been suspended from the African Union?
That is not the first time, by the way, we have had to answer that type of question. I remember the last time we were even talking, we still had to answer that question, especially because the African Union, in a way, has suspended the membership of Sudan until Sudan, in the African Union language, restores constitutional order.
But earlier you said the African Union doesn't have teeth to bite, so suspending it really doesn't mean a thing.
Oh yeah, well, the thing is, I have not changed my mind. You can actually talk the talk. And some people might feel comfortable or good or develop some good feelings because you have actually talked the talk. But the question is, can you in fact walk that talk so that that society, that country, its people can walk the walk?
Shaka, there is an interesting question here from Henry. He says, the situation between countries within the East African community is not stable. Should the East African community, that is Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, allow two other countries that have requested to join the East African community, that is DRC, Congo, and Somalia?
First of all, fundamentally, really, what makes the East African community tick is a wide market. So in terms of having, in fact, or securing a regional economic market, there is no contradiction in that. If you add, for example, the mighty Democratic Republic of Congo to the East African community, it really becomes the real deal. There's no question about it. And I don't see any reason why you don't have to add Somalia, and later perhaps even Ethiopia, and why not? But the question is, can it be transformed from a regional economic market to a democratic institution, a democratic entity that sets the bar very high and says that in order for you to gain membership in this club, you have to meet certain democratic threshold. I would like to see something like that happen, just like the European Union, for example. Not any country in Europe can join the European Union simply because it happens to be politically independent. You have to meet the democratic threshold. And I hope that one of these days that is going to happen. If it does not happen, I just hope that it will be reflected in the interests and concerns of the changing demographics, the young people that eventually are going to have to take over anyway.
Very briefly, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are going to look at the issue of refugees. We are going to look at, for example, why there are so many millions of Africans who are running away from the lands of their ancestors, running away from countries which are incredibly wealthy, and yet they live very poor lives. They are persecuted by their own people, whom we normally refer to as leaders. But those are not leaders. If you are a leader, you cannot harm your people. Those are rulers.
Shaka, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our viewers. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. In the meantime, I look forward to hosting you on another edition. Take care.
Thank you.